everybody's aware, we have the dates and everything on the web page. We're getting ready to do the press release. We're kind of holding off on that just because the COVID-19 stuff has been kind of dominating the press lately, and we don't want that to get buried, but also we want to confirm that we're going to be able to do it this year. So we're still planning for the same dates. You know, at this point, we've got a lot of stuff out to print and a lot of things are in the works, coordinating with volunteers and everything. So we're still looking at those same dates. We're not looking at changing them. If anything, that, you know, after kind of making the rounds, the question would be more of whether we canceled it or not this year, not so much changing things up. So after making the rounds, we're still planning to continue with Fire Free. We'll be maintaining our social distancing, of course, and looking at all those standards as we do look at volunteers. And we talked about how that would work and the safety out there of the volunteers. We may not have as many volunteers as before, and we've never asked the volunteers to help with unloading, but that occasionally happens. So this year, though, we're going to be encouraging people not to be helping to unload just because of the safety involved with having a couple of volunteers out there and then their exposure as well. So if you're coming out, plan to be doing a lot of unloading on your own. Wanted to also kind of hit on the point of, like, I know that this is kind of with the COVID-19, it's put everybody off on their schedules as far as holding some of their community days within the HOAs and in all of their neighborhoods. But we won't be able to change those dates, but I do want to put in a plug for the half price in the fall. If you're unable to plan around this year, the half price in the fall is still going to be happening. And then otherwise, you know, as another reminder, is it is only $4 a cubic yard to drop this off. I know even myself, I usually hold off for the Fire Free days. And then as I'm doing it, I'm reminded constantly that it's only $4. It would have been just as easy for me to do it anytime. Our outreach, education, networking, you know, so switching gears to thinking about what we've been doing as far as planning things into the future. One of the things we had was our Firewise workshops, where we were looking at those Firewise sites and trying to get together the current Firewise communities with those that are interested or heading in those directions. And as of now, I've postponed those due to the COVID stuff. So we've been looking through kind of how to do some kind of an interactive Zoom meeting. And I think that we've got a couple of good ideas of how we can do that. Some more information to come on that. Right now, we're just kind of sketching out how that would work, but we're thinking that we'd still be able to have some of those topics break into groups and openly discuss where we won't all be muted. You know, it won't be this format where this is more of a information delivery, but it'd be more of a conversation. So as those kind of get hammered out or worked out, I'll definitely keep everybody up to date. And we did have a couple of big meetings that were on our on the agenda, or at least I did, that were kind of hitting to quite a few HOAs. That was the Aubrey Butte Neighborhood Association and the Southwest Neighborhood Associations. And those have both been canceled, of course. You know, we were thinking we'd be looking somewhere around like 100 folks out at those meetings, and it was going to be hitting a pretty good sized group. So bummer that we're not able to do it, but also glad that I'm not causing any additional exposure to anybody. Firewise communities, got quite a few people in the process. So unfortunately, you know, I think Mountain High, talking with Bob, we kind of pulled back on doing the assessment, because generally the assessment is going out with the neighborhood, a few folks from the HOA, plus a few agency folks, myself, ODF, Ben Fire. And we walk and we talk about what those themes are, but we've, you know, we don't want to add any more exposure, so we kind of pushed that one back. However, there's several other communities out there, and I just want to make sure that if you're listening right now and you're in the process of becoming Firewise and you feel like you're stuck, send me an email or give me a phone call. Especially right now, email is going to be the best way to reach me, as I'm kind of in and out of the office, minimizing kind of the exposure in the office. But if you're feeling stuck, definitely reach out to me. At this point, I kind of feel like I've got everything kind of turned where I'm waiting on something. So if you feel like you're waiting on something, reach out to me, and I'll make sure that we're not waiting on each other or just, whatever it might be. We want to make sure we're not stuck. And then, our fire adapted communities networks, we were through that program, we were doing those home defensible space concept classes with Allison Green. She's been great at coordinating those classes, putting together the curriculum. And then unfortunately, we canceled the in-person classes. However, we did meet just the other day with Allison, and she had some really good ideas of how we could still proceed forward and be able to do those online. And I hate to say it, but all the online stuff, I've always sort of been skeptical, but what she's put together and what she's planning is pretty awesome. I believe we'll still be able to get all the content out that we were wanting to get and the interaction that we were hoping to have, or that we do have in person. So I'll be looking for that from Allison as well, as we're both kind of working together to work out those details. So I think that's everything I've got. So I think, just kind of summarizing, look for that press release coming out for Fire Free. Also our outreach, our Firewise workshops, there's more to come on that. And then those defensible space classes, there should be something coming in the near future as well. Okay, then back over to Ed.
So we'll pause for questions. I haven't seen anything come up in the chat. Does anybody have questions? Remember, you can unmute yourself if you like, or type a question up if that works for you better. Either way, we'll just give you a minute, and then we'll be I'm going to be in the process of handing over my screen to Zachariah.
This is Tony DeBone. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, we can.
Okay, so this is full-on technology demonstration for myself. I want to say good morning to everybody. I was installing this output right at the top of the hour, so I came in just a moment late. So just a few words, though, from the Board of Commissioners. We're meeting a couple times a week, very spread out in a small boardroom, talking about what we're doing as a county. I want to thank everybody for participating this morning. We do have discussions happen. COVID-19 update real quick. Did I just lose everybody?
Nope, you're still there.
Oh, okay. I think
there was a little glitch, but yeah, no.
Yep, different audio, something happened. Yeah, so we're working together. There's all the different departments. The health is really working hard. We do have that public health function at Deschutes County, so everybody, the whole population, we're working together right now. So I just wanted to say hi, acknowledge this technology. This is all of us working together, trying new things. So have a great day, everybody. And I'll still be on the call.
Great, thank you. All right, I haven't seen anybody put anything else in the chat, so I think we'll hand it over to Zachariah. It looks like he's got his screen up. And as you may or may not remember, we had this originally on our agenda to talk about the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee. There's several others. Zachariah is going to kind of take the lead on this presentation, but if there's particular questions, it'll be those of us kind of in that front row in the picture. Actually, myself, Nick Belilak is on, as well as Chris Gracia, this is the building official, and we all may chime in depending on either if Zachariah hands off a question or something comes up that one of those might address. So with that, we'll hand it off to Zachariah.
Thanks, Ed. Good morning, everybody. Ed, can you hear me on your end?
I can. Yep.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks and good morning. Sorry we can't do this presentation in person. I was hoping to share a lot of wall size display maps that we created for the Wildfire Committee, but hopefully the Zoom meeting will suffice and that you'll be able to get a good understanding of what the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee worked on and what their recommendations are. Right now on my end, I'll be full disclosure, this is my first Zoom meeting, so working through some kinks on this end, but I have my PowerPoint up, and I don't have I'm not seeing where there's a comment box at all. So I guess we'll hold questions until the end of the presentation, or if Ed, if you see a comment come up through your end, we can address it during the presentation as well. So
I'll do that. I'll keep an eye on the chat box.
okay, thank you. So yeah, as Ed mentioned, I'm an associate planner in the community development department. Nick Lilac, our community development department director, was also sort of on the what we call the project management team for the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee. Ed played a crucial role with his knowledge of the Oregon Department of Forestry rules and other Oregon administrative rules. Chris Gracia with his knowledge of the state building codes division's rules and regulations. We also had Doug Green, member of Project Wildfire, also with his expertise that he shared. A quick background of how the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee got started. The county staff engaged the board in the fall of 2018 to discuss one of the planning division's work plan projects, and that which involved this 2015 audit performed by the University of Oregon Community Services Center's recommendation, or they did an audit and they provided several recommendations on how we can bring our county code up to the best practices in regards to natural hazards. The timing coincided with the Oregon State Building Codes Division's consideration of wildfire hardening measures within their residential specialty code. And so county staff met with the county commissioners several times to discuss, to brief them on these two topics. We held a stakeholders meeting as well, and I believe it was early February of 2019, just to get an initial idea of what would be involved with consideration of, you know, what it may look like for adopting best practice standards if the county commissioners were interested in doing that, as well as understanding what the Building Codes Division's new standards would look like if they ended up to be adopted. And subsequently, the Building Codes Division did approve a new section of their Oregon Residential Specialty Code. It's called R327.4. So that's what I'll be a big part of what I'll be discussing today and what we focused on for the WMAC. After these several meetings and the initial stakeholder meeting, the board determined that establishing an ad hoc committee would really be the best option to review and recommend whether or not the county's wildfire hazard zone needs to be updated, whether, where, and how to implement the new R327.4 from the building code standpoint, and whether or not the county should consider additional land use protection strategies to mitigate wildfire. And so from there, the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee was created, otherwise known as the WMAC. So the board set forward three main objectives for the committee. The first being to recommend and update whether the wildfire hazard zone needs to be updated. This is based on Oregon Department of Forestry criteria and Oregon administrative rules. The second objective being to review and recommend whether and how to apply R327.4 construction standards. And an interesting point on that is that the county's building jurisdiction does include of course, the unincorporated county, but the cities of Sisters and La Pine as well. So we had to maintain regular communication with those jurisdictions to understand what their interests were with the new regulations, as well as the impact that the county may have in any sort of adoption of rules, what it may have on those local jurisdictions as well. And then third, as I said earlier, consideration of land use standards as well. Quick review of the logistics of the committee. There were 12 members representing quite the broad background of interest throughout our county. We had members of the real estate profession, the insurance profession, building industries, local homeowners, first responders, planning commissioners. So a good group of people with differing perspectives and opinions, and the committee was all well attended by all 12 members. We had lively discussions and debates, and one thing that I really appreciated at the end of the meeting, or at the end of the committee's time, is one thing everybody shared is just the appreciation of, you know, hey, we all had a lot of different views, but everybody appreciated how the meeting, just the candor and the civility of all the members. Everybody got along great, even though they shared a lot of differing perspectives and opinions. We had 9 meetings. We met bi-weekly starting in October and finished up in January of this year. And we maintained, or the county staff maintained, a project-specific website that's on your screen now, deschutes.org/wildfire committee. This website hosted all of the committee information, so meeting minutes, agenda, support materials. It was sort of our clearinghouse of information. It's still up and running as far as I know. And I encourage you all, if you haven't checked it out, to do so, especially if you're interested in more about the Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee. This is really where you can get all that information. Here's a list of our members on the committee. Just want to take a quick moment to recognize each one of them. I won't necessarily go through the list, but each one of these individuals provided or volunteered well over 20 hours of their time to meet, to come down to the county and have these discussions. There were evening meetings. We had each meeting was about 2.5 hours. So definitely a chunk out of their time. Just want to appreciate their time and commitment to the county to discuss these important issues. All right, so the recommendations here. And the first one we started on was the wildfire hazard zone. And as you can hopefully see on your screen to the right, this map is basically the raw data. So we, using the criteria that Oregon Department of Forestry provides, that is weather, slope, fuel hazard, and fuel distribution, we use geographic information systems, or GIS, to layer these informations together to understand where the hazard is in the county. And it's important to note that based on these Oregon administrative rules, we are limited in the where the risk or where the hazard is. This information is really focused on solely where the hazard is based on those 4 criteria. So, and we couldn't include anything else. So weather, slope, fuel hazard, fuel distribution. This map does a pretty good job. I hope it shows up well on your screen, where, you know, the areas with high slope have a pretty high total risk ranking or hazard ranking, and low-lying areas with you know, more grassland areas, low density of fuel, don't show up as a high hazard level. This map was the base map that informed several other maps that we provided to the committee. It's kind of a confusing, convoluted process to describe, especially through a Zoom meeting, but there are basically numbers assigned to this map, and when you draw a polygon around any areas within this map, you can create an average weighted average for any one of those areas. And if that calculation indicated for that polygon a 7 or higher, it was considered a wildfire hazard area. And so we were able to draw, the OERs don't describe what that landscape approach is. It could be the entire county, or it could be something smaller, such as community wildfire protection plan sub-region areas. And so we provided several different landscape approaches that we hoped would inform a discussion and enable others to consider, you know, what makes the most sense here to accurately represent a geographic scale of where the wildfire hazard is through our county. We provided 7 maps, quickly run over them: community wildfire protection plans, fire districts, school districts, the entire county, which is the status quo, and then also dividing those maps into rounded or raw numbers, because when you take a weighted average, you get a lot of decimal points, and whether or not you rounded numbers actually determine in some areas whether a region was considered a hazard or not. So after explaining that background and how we came up with those maps and the calculations, the wildfire committee voted on their maps based on which ones they think are most accurate or make the most sense. The first one that I'll show, let's see. Yeah, the next 2 maps I'll show were the maps that were voted on or received the highest amount of votes. This map that I'm currently displaying is a wildfire hazard zone that is based on community wildfire protection plan subregions. So the white areas that you see on this map are areas that are community wildfire protection plan subregions that did not score a 7 or higher. The red areas did. So the red areas are considered the hazard area, the white areas are not. The other map that's actually received the most amount of votes was a map based on the raw data and an average weighted calculation for the entire county, which was calculated, I think, to 7.23 or 7.27. This is actually the status quo. In, I believe, 2001, the county adopted a wildfire hazard zone based on the Oregon Department of Forestry criteria in order to look at specific standards regarding shake roofs. And it was determined at that point in time that the entire county was a wildfire hazard zone. And so this is what we called the status quo. We used updated information, created a landscape approach across the entire county, and the county calculation determined to be an entire wildfire hazard zone as well. So those 2 maps were forwarded to the county commissioners for consideration, and I'll get to that later about next steps and where we're at that. But the wildfire committee made 2 recommendations on the wildfire hazard zone with, you know, what updates should be provided. One was keep the status quo. The other one was update the map based on community wildfire protection plan subregions. All right, moving on to the second objective, and that is implementation of R327. We learned that there were very few jurisdictions that were considering R327.4. It's important to note that the Building Codes Division specifically created R327.4 to be optional for local jurisdictions. So there was some jurisdictions that were really interested in creating additional standards for residential development in their areas. And so they lobbied the BCD to create these additional standards. But fortunately, BCD allowed local jurisdictions to determine whether or not the local government was interested in adding those requirements to residential development. The new code allows or requires new construction within a wildfire hazard zone to use certain types of materials and incorporate specific designs for roofing, ventilation, exterior walls, siding, overhang projections, deck surfaces, windows, skylights, etc. Again, all this information, the specifics of that is provided on that project specific website I mentioned earlier. There are built-in exceptions within R327.4 as well. For example, subdivisions that are more than 50% built out are automatically exempted from their requirements. So whether or not the county commission decides to implement R327 isn't a simple yes or no decision. There are a lengthy amount of exception requirements, and as well as determining where the wildfire hazard zone is. So this took up I would say a majority of the wildfire committee's time, and there's a lot of discussion about where it should apply, as well as even if it should apply. Ultimately, the committee decided to recommend, if R327.4 is implemented, that it should apply in two different areas. And again, this ties back to the first objective that I covered. So where the wildfire hazard zone is, that's this map that you see now. That's one option, is the wildfire hazard zone map based on community wildfire protection plan areas. And then if you, based on these exception or exemption requirements, a subgroup broke out into, or they decided where the exception should apply based on this map. And where they decided it should apply is in the forest use zones, so F1 and F2, as well as the rural residential zone as well. And then it should only apply, the other requirement is that it should only apply to replacement dwellings and dwellings permitted on newly created parcels. And then there's that additional or built-in exemption of excluding subdivisions more than 50% out. So I'll quickly go back to that other slide. We start here, the wildfire hazard zone based on community wildfire protection plan areas, and then adding those additional requirements that were optional and recommended by a subgroup of the wildfire committee. The white areas expand out a little bit, or take over a few other areas, and scale back the implementation area of R327.4. So it takes out the exclusive farm use zone, for example, sort of in the foot area of the county, as well as many other zones, all other zones outside of forest use and rural residential. The other group that went down a list and decided what exemptions should be built into the implementation of R327 started with the entire county as a wildfire hazard zone. And they decided that they couldn't come up with a reason why they should exclude certain zones over other zones. And they also considered buffers around communities, and they decided that they felt like there wasn't a reason to do that either. So they basically took the entire county as a wildfire hazard zone and then recommended R327 should apply to all areas as much as possible. So the difference here between this map and this map are simply the subdivisions that have more than 50% built out. All other areas, all other zones would be subject to R327.4 as recommended by the other the group 2. So a quick summary of that objective implementation of R327.4. There were so optional for local governments. There was a lot of disagreement. There was about a split vote between the committee whether or not R327.4 should apply. And so we broke out into separate groups, and then each group looked at their own criteria for where R327.4 should apply if it is implemented. Group 1 said it should only apply to the wildfire hazard zone based on community wildfire protection plan areas. In addition to that, areas outside of the forest use and the rural residential areas should be exempted, as well as it should only apply to new lots and replacement dwellings, again, in the wildfire hazard zone. Group 2 took the entire county as a wildfire hazard zone and said it should apply to everywhere within that wildfire hazard zone. And that's the map you see now. And there are added areas, or there are white areas that were taken out of the wildfire hazard zone, and that's based on that built-in exemption of subdivisions built out more than 50%.
So Zachariah, Paula Simone had a quick clarifying question. Then she's wondering if, say in well, I'll just read it. In the Ag 10 area that falls in a white area, if they were to replace or build new, because the subdivision is built out more than 50%, it would be exempt?
Correct. Well, one recommendation is it would be exempt based on Group 1's recommendation of where R327.4 is implemented. And then the other group's recommendation was that it should apply everywhere. And if I understand the question, if a specific property is in a subdivision that is more than 50% built out, regardless of zone, they are exempt from complying with our 327.4 requirements. Correct. Does that answer the question?
Yep, I think it did.
Okay. All right. Moving on to the third objective of the WMAC, that's reviewing land use requirements. And so this is where the community service centers audit and report comes into play. This audit provided best practices from several jurisdictions across the nation on wildfire mitigation standards. We also, recognizing that the report was approximately 5 years old, we did a quick update or a refresher on best practices and looked at standards in Ashland and Jackson County, Wasco County, Flagstaff. Might be forgetting a few other ones, but we tried to update, make sure that those best practices in 2015 were supplemented with 2020 best practices. And the potential standards we discussed were defensible space, steep slope setbacks, access requirements, water supply requirements, and then signs, property address standards, as well as gate requirements. So So we provided, the staff for the support team provided an explanation of what those standards could look like. And then the committee had several discussions about whether or not they were necessary or effective. Eventually, the committee voted in favor of requiring defensible space, access, and steep slope setbacks for all new developments, regardless of location. There is also support for enforcing defensible space requirements on existing developments, and also unanimous support from the committee for increasing the county's community outreach and engagement efforts on wildfire mitigation, which obviously Project Wildfire is a part of and knows well about our what the county does. One thing I'll just note is that there was discussion about not just what these standards look like, but where they could be implemented as well. You know, are they implemented based on the wildfire hazard zone and whether or not that's updated? Are they, do we look at existing development, or do we only apply such standards to new development? As some of you may know, Deschutes County, and certainly Ed can speak to this in more specifics than I can, but Deschutes County has standards on the books now in the administration part of our code that requires defensible space for unprotected lands in the county. And so we shared this with the committee, obviously, and they felt strongly enough to suggest that those standards, basically what we have on the books now, are expanded and implemented across the county as well. Lastly, I'll share that there was lots of discussion about what the requirements of the implementation should include. And just a quick summary, committee members felt like regulation should be easily understood by the average property owner. They didn't feel or they didn't support the need for complicated regulations that would involve lawyers or other professional staff to help interpret that. Costs should be kept to a minimum. Property owners should be able to use hand-drawn site plans, not need, again, the professional expertise to create, a specific or hire a land surveyor, for example, to create a site plan. They encouraged the county to seek grants and other financial aid to help property owners with limited incomes. They felt like code enforcement should not be punitive, and that we should seek education and voluntary compliance first, which I'll share is sort of the status quo is what the county operates on anyways in code enforcement. So that covers the land use side of it. A quick review of the major discussion points. Updating the wildfire hazard zone was a main topic and created a lot of discussion and some concern, recognizing that because the county has existing standards prohibiting shake roofs, if we update the wildfire hazard zone, that takes away from certain or doesn't include all areas within a wildfire hazard zone. There's concern that new development could include shake roofs. More discussion on whether or not we could have an exemption or have 2 wildfire hazard zones, but not to get in the weeds there, just sharing that that was a major discussion point, whether or not the wildfire hazard zone should be updated. Costs were another major topic and discussion point. There was a lot of concern about the impact of additional regulations and the costs that they create for homeowners There was a lot of discussion about whether or not R327.4 or what type of costs we're talking about with requiring R327.4. They range from no cost difference to potential increase of approximately $15,000 for a single family residence. And then there were costs associated with implementing land use requirements as well, defensible space, for example. And then the committee was also very mindful of balancing regulation and safety. And that was a common theme throughout the committee's meetings and discussions. Next steps, we are finalizing a final report. There's a draft version that was shared with the county commissioners and planning commission about a month or so ago now. We're working on finalizing that. Staff and the board were tracking what the state legislature was doing in regards to a specific Senate bill that actually looked at a lot of the things the wildfire committee considered and discussed. As you all probably know, the state legislature didn't end up voting or further, they didn't vote on this specific Senate bill. And so it's up in the air whether it will come back in a special session or next year. So there's obviously discussion that staff needs to have with the board on how we proceed with the committee's findings and recommendations. And as we started off this discussion, there is the big unknown of the COVID-19 situation and the need to limit meetings and face-to-face meetings, and sort of has reprioritized some of the county's objectives now. So I'm not sure if Ed or Nick or Chris have any other comments or things they want to share, but that is what I have to share, and would be happy to answer any questions from Project Wildfire members as well.
So this is Ed. Just a reminder, you can unmute yourself, so you have that ability if you want to ask a question over the audio, or feel free to type in a question. We have a few minutes left, and would love to, if there's any questions, to be able to answer those.
Hi, Zachariah. This is Ray Meow.
Hi, Ray.
Just to be clear, the option 1 excludes agricultural lands, all agricultural lands. Is that the big difference?
That is one of the major differences, yes. Exclusive farm use or ag lands in the county do compromise a significant mass of land in the county. And based on one of the recommendations, it does, the committee, a portion of the committee recommended that ag lands are excluded, and it's just focused on the forest use zones and rural residential.
So if those ag lands then get incorporated to be further developed, going into a UGB, they would be included, or will they still be excluded?
If they were included in a urban growth boundary, then they would actually fall under the jurisdiction of a city, and where the county doesn't necessarily have jurisdiction.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Hypothetically, if such an area was rezoned or designated as rural residential, in theory, it would apply there, but I'll admit a lot of unknowns, a lot of questions about how how all this would be implemented, and what about these unknown situations that may come up with changing of zones and designation of land.
Oh, so if somebody were to be able to get rezoned and do something like the tree farm development, they may or may not be exempt.
In short, yes. It would, redesignation could potentially change their requirements.
Ed,
So-
this is Nick. Ed, can you hear me? This is Nick Lelak.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ed. I think, first of all, I really appreciate the committee moving forward, at Project Wildfire moving forward, and everybody having this really important conversation about these topics, because as impactful as COVID-19 is, obviously it's not going to stop wildfire season from coming. So this is just one piece of that larger puzzle. Number two, we're going to be watching very closely, we being Deschutes County, watching very closely the May 20 legislative session after the budget forecast is released, because we understand a lot of bills that had passed committees just in the last month will be reintroduced in the very short session. And it very well could be that one of the bills to establish a wildfire land use policy committee comprised of about 35 different organizations or individuals, stakeholders, et cetera, around the state could be assembled with funding from the state potentially, given their financial constraints now as well. But continue to tackle some of these issues at the state level. So we're going to be monitoring that situation very carefully as well, because that could have a direct impact on our county's conversations and considerations of the committee's recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Anybody else with questions?
I'll share if there are any follow-up questions. My email address here is on the screen, and I'm happy to chat further with anybody, as well as if you just want more examples of all the maps the committee considered, or what the votes were, the specific recommendations. All that information is available on this website, deschutes.org/wildfire committee as well.
All right. Well, thanks, Zachariah. I'm glad we were able to still pull off this meeting today. We had pretty good attendance. Hopefully this worked for folks on the online here. I would encourage you, because I'm anticipating that we may be offering a similar meeting opportunity next month in April. Obviously with a different topic, we have one in the works. But I would anticipate that we'd be doing a similar Zoom meeting. So if you have feedback that you want to share with either myself or Boone, please send it our way for anything that either worked and you like, or that didn't work. Next meeting, we'll probably go back to our regular hour-and-a-half format and provide some time for anybody that wants to provide updates or discussion as well, just off-topic updates. So we'll probably do half the meeting as a presentation and the other half as just kind of our general roundtable updates, and try to make that work for you all so we can keep connected and keep our momentum going, and keep all the communication channels that we can open as we come into the early part of spring and fire season and fire free and all our different events there that we're still hoping to move forward. So with that, haven't seen any other chats. If anybody, like I said, wants to look us up, you can find us on email or get a hold of us on the phone. And want to thank you all for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Ed.